Hello again. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 19, Section 2, The Second New Deal. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the critics of FDR. And he had critics on both sides, those people who would be considered to be conservatives, those people who would be considered liberals. We're going to start with the conservatives or the critics on the right. And those people on the right claimed that the New Deal, for the most part, regulated businesses too tightly and expanded the federal government's power at the expense of the states, and that deficit spending was going to become very dangerous. What I think is interesting is when we talk about the right, you don't have to necessarily talk about it in terms of political parties. Al Smith, who you see pictured here in the bottom left-hand corner, Al Smith was a Democrat. He had actually ran for president in 1928 against Hoover, Hoover being the Republican, Smith being the Democrat. Smith, if you remember back to the 1920s, was a Roman Catholic. But Smith and FDR, who, by the way, were both governors of New York, were kind of bitter enemies. Smith had wanted to run for president in 1932 and was defeated in some of the primaries by FDR, and hence that kind of like sets the tone here for their relationship. Smith was really concerned about the fact that the New Deal was really spending money too wildly, and certainly that the states were going to lose their voice. You didn't have to necessarily be a Republican to be opposed to it. And that's kind of an interesting thing to say, though. What I think is far more entertaining is the fact that when we look at the elections of 1936 and 1940, Al Smith is going to back the Republican candidates. So he's not even going to, stand with his own political party because of some of these issues. All right. Other critics that we have critics on the left. These people are the ones who think maybe Roosevelt hasn't done quite enough with these New Deal programs. And certainly they believe that the government should be intervening more, and that the federal government should expand its sizes and powers as far as helping intervene with the economy. They wanted to give more money to the middle class and the poor. One of their most vocal advocates is this fellow from Louisiana, kind of nicknamed the Kingfish, Huey P. Long. Huey Long probably today would be kind of called like a socialist. Maybe he has a lot in common with Bernie Sanders in a sense. He was a guy who wanted to make sure that the poor man was going to be looked out for, and hence he was very critical of FDR. Matter of fact, he was campaigning to run in 1936. He had a lot of support in his home state of Louisiana, where he had been governor and such. But this man's going to be assassinated by someone who thought maybe it would be best to stop his campaign cold in his tracks. But nevertheless, he certainly had a very strong base down in the state of Louisiana. And there was that thought that maybe he could actually become the Democratic nominee. There were other individuals who were very critical of the fact that FDR hadn't done quite enough. One was a fellow named Father Charles Coughlin. Coughlin, just so you know, not actually American. He was Canadian, but ended up being a priest in the United States. And he thought that the president could do more to help. He was concerned about primarily the banking industry. And on a side note, maybe not necessarily so positive, Coughlin, for the most part, was kind of an anti-Semite. And this is eventually going to catch up with him when we talk about the Roman Catholic Church, because he was very vocal about his feelings about the Jewish population, that he eventually is going to be excommunicated. But needless to say, Coughlin wanted to do the following. He wanted to inflate currency. In other words, put more money out into circulation that would push up basically the value of that, meaning that it was going to are going to take more to buy certain products. He also wanted to nationalize banking. In other words, the federal government would control that. He formed an organization known as the National Union of Social Justice, and he was able to promote that through his weekly radio broadcast before he was excommunicated. There are some people that thought that maybe he was a little too extreme because, at some point in time he's going to start talking about his admiration to guys like Adolf Hitler, and needless to say that did not set well with the Catholic Church by any means. Another fella that is going to be promoting his liberal ideas was a guy named Dr. Francis Townshend. He proposed a way to free up jobs for the unemployed, and he did this by kind of talking about something that is eventually going to happen, where he's kind of proposing like a Social Security program, but it's not quite Social Security as we know it. He basically said that the federal government would pay citizens over the age of 60 a pension of $200 a month. This is, 1930s money, so $200 a month was quite a bit of money. And you got to remember, life expectancy back in those days, if you were 60, you were old. And hence, maybe you wouldn't be living beyond the age of 70 and such. So this whole idea of paying that monthly pension for many, many years wouldn't necessarily go on forever, kind of like how it is today. But these people who would receive the money would be required to retire. They could not hold a job. And that $200 that they would receive, they had to spend the entirety of that check every month. If they didn't spend it all, it had to go back to the federal government. It's kind of a crazy idea, but in a way, it has a lot in common with some of the things with Social Security, which we'll eventually talk about. All right, the WPA. What was the result of the Works Progress Administration? This was a program of what I would call the Second New Deal. It started in 1935, kind of replaced the Public Works Administration. But the WPA spent quite a bit of money, $11 billion in the 1930s. That's a substantial amount. They employed 8.5 million workers, and they constructed things like highways, bridges, roads, public buildings, parks, airports. If you look around the state of Nebraska, there were many bridges, and I'm not talking like big highway bridges. I'm talking like county bridges that might be out in the country and such. There are some of these bridges that were built in the 1930s that we're still using today, which is kind of crazy, but that's the extent of this project. It certainly changed the way that we travel in this country. A lot of the airports that we see in Nebraska, the airport in Norfolk and Columbus and Grand Island, and when we talk about Kearney and such, all that was built with WPA funds. Parks as well. I know in my husband's hometown, there was a dance hall that was built by the WPA, still standing to this day. It certainly changed a lot of things. When we talk about artists, there were artists that were hired by the WPA to create murals and such. In Platte County, in the Loop Public Power Building, which is in Columbus in the downtown area, there is a mural that's in there of the Platte River Valley that was painted by an artist from Shelby, and it goes back to the funding from the WPA. So certainly you could see a lot of work around this nation that is attributed to this program. All right. Let's talk about controversies. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court's role in regulating all of this stuff with the New Deal. And probably one of the more pivotal cases that comes out of the Supreme Court is the Schechter Poultry Company versus the United States. And I'm going to go ahead and clear this away, but I'm going to kind of try to explain what this is all about. Schechter Poultry was a company that processed chickens. This case went before the Supreme Court in 1935. And what it basically kind of comes down to is that Schechter Poultry was buying live poultry, live chickens, from commissioners in New York City and Philadelphia, and then they sold the finished product in their stores in Brooklyn, New York. Schechter was charged by the government for violating the poultry code and selling unfit chickens, and then also illegally selling chickens on an individual basis so that they could avoid being inspected. Okay. Um, this all kind of ties into the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA, which basically allowed for trade groups to set up codes to promote fair competition so that they would set the maximum hours and safety regulations. Needless to say, this case was heard in the state of New York, and then eventually it makes its way to the Supreme Court. And what's interesting is there were basically two questions at stake here. Does the NIRA violate the separation of powers, which is basically saying that our branches of government have certain powers that have been delegated to it, and that they shouldn't override those powers? So the legislative branch typically is writing laws, the executive branch is executing those laws, and the Supreme Court is interpreting those laws. And the other question is, does the NIRA violate the 10th Amendment? 10th Amendment basically says, to the Constitution, says that there are certain powers that are reserved for the states. Okay, and does it overstep the federal power of using the Interstate Commerce Clause, which allows for the government to kind of like oversee basically trade that's happening between states? Okay, so the Supreme Court, they hear this case and they basically overturn the decision that's at the lower level. And basically, Schechter is found to be in the right for what they were doing. Okay. The Supreme Court basically said that the Roosevelt administration was being unconstitutional because it was taking on legislative powers. In other words, the president was trying to write law. Uh, and then Roosevelt can't use the Interstate Commerce Clause to regulate, what's happening here, any kind of business. And this ruling so upsets FDR that he's going to take revenge. But you're going to have to wait to Section 3 to hear about this court packing plan that he has to get his revenge on the Supreme Court. But needless to say, the Supreme Court rules that the Constitution did not allow Congress to delegate powers to the executive branch, and hence Schechter is off the hook. All right, the Wagner Act. Wagner Act, for the most part, kind of goes down to talking a little bit about regulation of industry and labor for the most part. So how did the National Labor Relations Act protect workers? One, it allowed for workers to organize unions to bargain collectively, which basically means that they can send a team in to negotiate with the owners of businesses for the employees. In other words, they can negotiate for better wages and better working conditions and such. They set up the National Labor Relations Board, and this set up a process for binding arbitration. Arbitration is like negotiation, and if you don't follow those things that have been negotiated because it's binding legally, this would be an opportunity to take the employer to court. Okay, so this also authorized the NLRB to investigate employee actions. So, needless to say, this kind of sets up a lot of stuff that we kind of are familiar with labor in this day and age. What was one of the main goals of the Committee for Industrial Organization, or the CIO? The CIO's, their big purpose was to organize unions that included all workers. Okay, so it didn't matter if you were skilled or unskilled within any industry, all workers are going to be organized together. This kind of goes back to some of the things that we talked about in this area after the Reconstruction, this whole idea of like the Wobblies and the IWW and such. But needless to say, certainly we wanted to make sure that workers had a voice, and this was a very trying time, and hence this is why the CIO kind of came about. How were the sit-down strikes at General Motors finally resolved? Sit-down strike is a type of strike where the workers go into the factory but sit down and refuse to work. You can kind of see that photo in the bottom right-hand corner. This strike was basically resolved when General Motors authorized the United Auto Workers, or UAW, to basically be the sole bargaining agent. And by the way, the UAW is still the big negotiator for labor in the automobile industry. Okay, it's crazy how that all goes down. Social Security. Remember we talked about Dr. Townshend a little bit ago? Anyway, what was one of the major goals of the Social Security Act? One was to provide some type of security for elderly and unemployed workers in the United States. So we're going to set up this agency here to kind of regulate this. You had to apply for numbers, and eventually every American is going to be issued a Social Security ID. But initially, the act left out a certain group of people, and that were those people who were farmers and domestic workers. So if you were living out here on the farm or working on a farm, you were not able to claim Social Security. Now, Social Security and the whole act itself has been, for the most part, edited over the years, and today everyone is kind of included in that. It's crazy. All right, thank you very much.